Okay, everyone, it just turned 1:05. If more participants do come, I will let them in. But for now, I'm gonna start just to get everything rolling. Um, okay. So, hi everyone. I am Casey Hummeldorf. I'm one of the Girl Scouts in the Manassas Park area. Um, this this is my first gardening workshop, first workshop I've held. I am so thankful to be partnering with the Manassas Park City Library and um, Virginia Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners of Prince William to bring you guys gardening workshops and to get a seed exchange box located at the Manassas Park City Library. Valerie, if you want to introduce a bit about yourself and about what the library is doing in their part for this.
Sure, thank you, Casey. So my name is Valerie. I oversee the programming here at the Manassas Park City Library. When Casey reached out to us, we were thrilled. I do have a passion for gardening myself. I brought all of my plants into the library, but we've installed the seed exchange on the corner of the library, and it's right next to the Blooms Trail. So we get a lot of foot traffic there. We have a lot of outdoor enthusiasts out there. So it was really a great idea for Casey to put her seed exchange there. But we're really looking forward to the gardening workshops that we have, especially with spring coming up and everybody getting more outside. So we'll let you take it away, Casey, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box as we go. And if there are any questions that pop up, I will let you know, or I'll try to answer them.
Okay. So just an overview of what to expect today and what the rules are. We just did the introductions. We're gonna watch a video provided by the VCE Master Gardeners, and then we're gonna do a Q&A and closing for the last 10 minutes. Please stay muted, put your questions in the chat. Me and Valerie will try to answer any questions you guys have. No spamming the chat. I'm sure you guys won't do that, but I still want to put that in the rules just to preface that, yeah, this happens. I would prefer that not to happen here. These sessions will be recorded and uploaded onto YouTube. If you don't feel comfortable with that, you are free to leave and watch this video on YouTube later. But yeah. So again, we've partnered with the VCE Prince William Master Gardeners, and they're allowing us to use the videos on their YouTube channel for these sessions. So yeah, let me know if you guys can't hear it in the chat. This again is my first time hosting one of these, so we might have some sound difficulties.
So the first thing you want to think about if you're starting a garden is figuring out what space you should use. And there's some things that you want to think about. Is there water close by? Nobody likes to be hauling water in the middle of August, especially if you've got to do it from a far distance. You know, so you need to think about that. You need to think about, is there enough sunlight? You know, most vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, and with a lot of vegetables, more is better. With some of our leafy greens and some of our herbs, 6 is fine, but with a lot of our vegetables, especially our fruiting vegetables, we're going to need 8 or more hours of sunlight. And you want to think about when you're siting, think about the shadows that are cast by the trees, by your house, by other buildings. And you want to think about this when the trees have leafed out. You don't want to site your garden before the trees have leafed out and not think about what are those trees going to look like, what kind of shadows they're going to give. The other question is it going to be well drained? Most of our vegetables don't like to be in wet spots. You get a lot of rot and you get a lot of disease that way. So you want to find some place that's well drained. And if you're digging in the ground to make your garden, you want to think about what might be in the way. Some of our soils are very rocky. If you've got trees nearby, sometimes you've got thick roots that'll interfere. And most importantly, you want to make sure that you call and make sure there are no utility lines, because the last thing you want to do is have a problem with utilities as you dig. So once you've sited your garden, the big thing to think about is soil, and really understanding your soil is the key to making your garden successful. We can get lots of plants, we can learn lots about plants, but what's going on underneath, the things that we can't see, are oftentimes really critical to what's going on. And so we want to protect our soil and we want to encourage soil biology. So what is soil? It's not just dirt. It's not just a place to plant things. It's a complex community. It's an ecosystem all itself. And there are inorganic parts, sand and clay and those sorts of things. There's what we refer to as the microherd. These are the microscopic organisms that are in the soil. Some of them are harmful. Most of them aren't harmful or beneficial, and some of those are beneficial. Our not so microherd are the bigger things that we can see, and they run everything from something like as big as a groundhog to smaller insects. And then we have plant roots and then other soil organic matter, which is basically anything that was organic that's decaying. And the focus of that soil ecosystem when it comes to plants is what we refer to as the rhizosphere. This is the area that it's around the roots. And so in a healthy soil, plants are going to make sugars, and they're going to contribute up to a quarter, sometimes maybe even a third of the sugar that they create, and they're going to give that to the microbes. The reason they're doing that is they're supporting the microbial life around those roots. Those microbes in turn are doing a number of things. They're protecting the roots. In some cases, they're bringing in nutrients. In some cases, they're bringing in water. In some cases, they're putting out chemical defenses that enable the plant to fight off disease. And it's in this rhizosphere that we want to really encourage plants and the microbes to work together. And when they work together, we have a lot less of a problem dealing with things like disease. So what is a good soil? Well, there are lots of things. High organic matter, good structure, that means having macropores and micropores. You've got big spaces for roots to grow, water to infiltrate through, and then micropores help hold some of that water for later on when there are droughts. There are pockets where microbes can grow. So we want a good mix of big and small pores. We want significant water infiltration. We want plant available water. That means that not only will water go into the soil, but it will hold on to enough of that water that the plants can use it. We want a good habitat for those soil organisms, big and small. We want plants that grow in that to have a good size root mass. We want to make sure it's got good pH. We want it low in salt, low in toxic elements, and a balanced fertility. Remember, in nature, fertilizer is not a source of fertility. In a balanced ecosystem, Nutrients are cycling all the time. And it's that biology in the soil that's doing that. And so what these all have in common is that these are made possible by the living, biologically active soil. And the better of an ecosystem we create in the soil for them, the easier it will be for our plants. So in an ideal situation, we would like about 50% pore space for water and air to be. We'd like about 50% to be solids. And most of that solids we want inorganic minerals, our clays, our sands, our silt. In a truly ideal situation, we'd like that mix to be a loam consistency. And then we want about a 5% organic matter. And that creates a soil that's biologically active. It's kind of like a sponge. It will soak up water and then release it when it's needed. Unfortunately, this is typically what we're left with in the soils that we have to deal with here in Northern Virginia. Most of the time we're dealing with a mix of grass and weeds. It's so compacted that plants don't grow very well in there. There are minerals there, but they may not all be available. There's not a whole lot of organic matter. There's little signs of life in the soil. It favors anaerobic conditions, which are conditions that don't have oxygen, and most of the bad players in the soil like anaerobic conditions. The other problem with this is that a lot of times the water runs off, it doesn't run in, and so a lot of times when we get a heavy rain, all that water washes off into the waterways and very little of it actually goes into the soil. So basically we're trying to grow grass or plants in a brick. And that's great if you've got a chia pet, but in reality, it just doesn't work very well, not on our landscapes. So there are a lot of things that we do that actually inhibit the soil health. And one of the big ones, especially in spring, is trying to work the soil while it's too wet. We get a lot of rain in the spring. People get eager to get out and do something in the yard. So they end up working soil before it's really ready. And the way that you tell if your soil is ready, you get a handful of soil, put it in a ball, and if it retains its shape with light pressure, you want to wait until you work the soil until there's less water in it. But if it crumbles with light pressure, if just a little bit of pressure with your thumb causes it to crumble, then it's ready to work. The other things that we do is we tend to compact the soil. Sometimes it's a function of how our lawns and landscapes have been developed as we're building houses on them. Tillage itself, digging in the soil, it's a tool that needs to be used judiciously because excessive tillage will inhibit this healthy soil. It'll do a lot of damage. And so when you till, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, you need to do it judiciously. And then using pesticides, and last one should be synthetic fertilizers. Pesticides and fertilizers are salts, and so most of our friendly biology in the soil are not used to salts. They didn't evolve in a salty situation, and so when we add those things, it creates an issue in the ecosystem, and it really stunts their growth. So we want to try and avoid pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. So if we look at tillage, tillage is kind of a scale of what's more damaging versus less damaging. And tillage is really working the soil. And on the top row, we're looking at ways that we till to really start a garden. And on the bottom, we're looking more at things that are, if you have an existing garden, what can you do? Very few of us have garden plots that are big enough for conventional plowing. So most of the time we're talking about using a rototiller. And if you think about what a rototiller is actually doing to the soil, it's beating up the soil, it's breaking up soil particles. It's really, think of it as a devastating earthquake for us is basically what's going on for the soil organisms. Slightly less intrusive is double digging, and I'll show you what that means in a moment. Double digging is a lot of work, but in an ideal situation, you only have to double dig once or twice. And then the least damaging is what's known as sheet mulching or lasagna gardening, where you're letting nature break down things and create a better soil condition for you. If you've already got a soil, if you already have a garden, again, rototilling is a lot of damage. You can do what's referred to as strip tillage, where you're only doing a thin row where you're going to actually plant. And then the less damaging is what we refer to as minimal disturbance or no-till drill, where you're just making holes where you're putting the plants in. You're not doing any other tillage. There are some crops that are really difficult to do without tillage. Potatoes, for example, there are ways you can do it, there are ways you can't. Sweet potatoes, it's really hard to grow sweet potatoes and get them out of the ground without doing some tillage, and the same is true with potatoes. So some tillage is necessary, you just have to think about it and try to do as little as possible. Double digging is really a system of removing the turf, digging a trench, loosening what's in the trench, amending it with compost, backfilling the trench, and then, and then moving to the next trench. So you're constantly on the move, filling things with compost. It creates a more loose and open soil. Like I say, it's a lot of work, but typically when double digging is done, you only need to do it once, and then you can do no-till things after that. Sheet mulching is basically taking, it's kind of like composting in a way. So a lot of times we start with grass and we cover that with thick cardboard, and then we layer it with greens that are high in nitrogen, like grass clippings and vegetable scraps. And then we layer it with a few inches of browns, which are things like shredded leaves and paper that have a high carbon content. The only brown that is technically a green is actually coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are high in nitrogen, so they would go with the greens. But you do several layers of that. And then at the top of that, depending on the situation, you either cover it with mulch or you cover it with compost and then put a cover crop in it. The problem with sheet mulching is it takes a while for everything to break down. And so typically when we do sheet mulching, we'll do it in the fall to have a garden ready in the spring, or we'll do it in the spring to have a garden ready in the fall. Now, when we do sheet mulching in the spring, because it's all biology that's working on this, a lot of times if there's enough moisture and warmth, sometimes midsummer we can start planting. So this is an example of sheet mulching, putting down cardboard to take care of this turf. We've covered it with a layer of, in this case, mulch. This was a situation where we had to do this over the course of 2 weeks, and so we put the mulch down to make sure the cardboard didn't blow away. Here we are starting again. We've got cardboard, we've got some greens. In this case, we put coffee as the greens. We layered it with whatever scrap vegetation we had. In this case, some of this was iris clippings, some of this was shrub clippings. We were expecting a frost, and this is nasturtium, and we had a nasturtium plant that we knew would be killed by the frost, so we harvested that nasturtium and we used that as part of our greens to recycle it. And so here we have several beds that are in various stages of being set up. You can see on the left, it's got 3 layers of green, 2 of brown. The next one has 3 layers of green, 3 layers of brown, and then the following 2 are quote unquote finished. They've got the 3 layers, they've been covered in compost, and a cover crop was planted. This was done, I want to say in late October, early November. And then by the following spring, they were ready to plant. So let's stop and see if there are questions. If there are any questions to be answered here. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so we'll move on. So once we've got our bed set up, we need to think about the soil chemistry. There we go. So again, in the outside world, when you've got a functioning ecosystem, you don't need fertilizer inputs. However, if you think about a garden, you're taking things out of the system. And so sometimes you need to add fertilizer. And so typically when we apply fertilizer, we're looking at nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium or all three. Nitrogen's good for green growth. It helps with plants forming protein. Phosphorus is good for root growth. Phosphorus also is good later on because it does help with flower and fruit development. And potassium is really good for overall plant health, and it helps plants tolerate extremes of temperature and drought. So having that balanced is important. The amount that you need really depends on the plant. It depends on how intense you're growing and the growing conditions. We recommend getting a soil test to make sure that you know what's in your garden so that you can add the proper nutrients. Keep in mind too that excessive nutrients are going to be detrimental to the plant and to water quality. Excessive nutrients can run off and get into waterways. They also, especially with nitrogen, if you add too much nitrogen, you're encouraging a lot of green growth, and excessive green growth is going to bring in insect predators that are going to attack your plant. The other thing to keep in mind is it doesn't matter what nutrients are in the soil. If the pH is messed up, the nutrients are going to be locked up and they're going to be not plant available. So pH is a measure of acidity and alkalinity. Most of our soils tend to be very acidic. Most of our vegetables prefer a slightly acidic pH range. And so our soils are built for growing trees, which like more acidic conditions. So a lot of times we need to test our soil to make sure the pH is where it needs to be. And it's important that you test through a lab. The reason you want to test through a lab instead of getting one of those meters you find at the box stores or a garden center, first of all, sometimes those meters are not calibrated correctly. pH meter is no good if it's not calibrated correctly. But the other problem with that is, assuming it's calibrated correctly, you have a pH, but it doesn't tell you what you need to do to change the pH to where you want it to go. If you do it through a lab, they do what's referred to as a buffer test, and they can tell you how much lime to add to change the pH to something that you want for your vegetables or whatever crop you're growing. And like I say, most of our vegetables want to be in the 6 to 6.5 range. There are some types of potatoes that like it in the 5s. Blueberries like it in the 5s. So you have to know what you're growing. But if you have questions about taking a soil test or interpreting a soil test report, email the extension office and we're happy to go over it with you. A couple things about fertilizer. There are organic fertilizer, which are derived from animal products, although our mineral fertilizers are considered organic in terms of, is it organic produce? But they're really inorganic if you think about them chemistry. But phosphate, which is where we get most of our phosphorus, comes from a mineral, but most of our other organic stuff are from byproducts. And so things like cottonseed meal or blood meal or corn gluten meal. And then we have synthetic fertilizers, which are chemically derived products, and they're typically salts. These are things like Miracle Grow, and Scott's fertilizer that you put on the lawn. And these can shift the pH over time. So again, you want to be, if you're using synthetic fertilizers, you especially want to be monitoring your pH on a regular basis. When it comes down to it, though, 90% of nutrient cycling is biological and not chemical. And so the nitrogen has to be in the form of nitrate in order for the plants to take it up. And so with organic, you're allowing the biology to work through that, and you're allowing that ecosystem to function and develop. With synthetic fertilizers, sometimes they will be able to put, nitrates directly into the soil. The problem with that is that it breaks up that symbiotic relationship between plants and the microbes in the rhizosphere. If plants are getting all the nutrients they need from nitrates, from synthetic fertilizer, they don't have a lot of reason to work with the microbes. And in turn, the microbes don't have a lot of reason to give some of the disease protection and other protections they do to the plants.
Now I'm going to stop right here and jump in by saying that they don't specify the price that VCE has for soil test samples. So if you're going to get your soil tested via the VCE, there is a $10 fee you have to pay to get it tested and get the results. Again, email the extension office if you have any questions on that. I will give you the email to the extension office at the end of this presentation. I just wanted to jump in and quickly say that if you are planning on sending any soil samples to get tested by the VCE.
So you end up using fungicides and other things on your plants instead of letting nature take care of it for you. When you're choosing a fertilizer, you want to look at the guaranteed analysis. It has more detail on exactly what's going on, but again, we're usually adding the big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so a lot of times in the front of the bag, you've got those three numbers in that order. And this is the percentage of the bag by weight. And so if we see in the upper right corner, this Burpee organic blood meal, it's a 3-pound bag, it's a 1200, so 12% of that 3 pounds is actually nitrogen, or there's 0.36 pounds of nitrogen in that blood meal. And you'll notice organic versus synthetic, organics tend to have lower percentages of nitrogen. It's just the way it is. And it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. And then if you look at down here at the bottom on the left, where we've got the analysis of garden tone, this is more detailed. And this will tell you what micronutrients might be in there. In this case, you've got calcium, you've got magnesium, you've got some sulfur, boron, chloride, some copper, some iron. Typically, with our vegetables, we have enough of these micronutrients in the soil. Occasionally, we run into issues of deficiency, but typically not with our vegetable gardens. Even if you want to avoid using fertilizers, sometimes heavy nitrogen fertilizers or feeders can benefit from fertilizer, even in your really good soil. But you need to think about timing. And sometimes it's to ensure a higher yield and not excessive green growth. So for example, you've got tomatoes, you want those tomatoes, you want to produce a lot of tomatoes because maybe you're doing some canning. You want to set your nitrogen early on, a little bit at the start and a little bit right at the start of fruiting. If you get into after it started fruiting too long, you're going to end up with a lot of green top growth and not as many tomatoes. So you have to think about that, timing, what you're trying to achieve when you're thinking about how much fertilizer should I add.
So let's talk a little bit more about rebuilding our soil so we have a good, healthy soil, taking the bricks that most of us are stuck with and turning it into that nice, spongy, plant-friendly soil. So the first thing we want to do is we want to reduce disturbance. We want to dig in it as little as possible, as infrequently as possible. We want to make sure that what we're putting into it is both plant friendly and microbe friendly. So again, ideally, we want to stay away from the synthetic stuff and use organic matter and organic fertilizers. We want to mix plant species. The more plants we have, the bigger the biodiversity, both above ground and underground. So we've got more symbiotic relationships going on. We've got more types of microbes fighting off the bad microbes. We want to keep our soil covered throughout the year. We're not going to go into cover crops a whole lot here, but cover crops are an important way to manage your soil. If you think about it, the biology in the soil runs on carbon. That is the basic food source. And where it gets that carbon is from plant matter. And so if you have bare soil over the winter, you're missing out on all that potential carbon that you can be creating. Whereas if you have a cover crop, you are collecting carbon, and again, because of those symbiotic relationships, you're feeding those microbes throughout the year. The other thing about covering the soil is it prevents erosion. Soil is a precious nutrient, or precious resource, and unfortunately, because of erosion, we're losing lots of it. So we want to make sure that it's covered and protected. And we want to maximize living roots. We want to make sure that there are living roots, plants growing in the soil, capturing as much sunlight as possible, fostering that ecosystem, making sure that the system is working. Soil health is all about biology. And if we support the soil ecosystem, it takes care of most of our problems. It's not going to take care of everything. Nature is not an all or nothing thing. It's shades of gray. But it will control a lot of problems, so we don't have to. The more we mimic nature, the healthier our plants will be. So I'm not sure if this is going to run, but we're going to try this.
Hey, Thomas, you had a question or two about diatomaceous earth.
Okay, let me stop here and we'll come back to that. Let's see, what is the question about diatomaceous earth? So
I think
just in general. So diatomaceous earth, if you don't know, is typically there are two types. One you use outdoors, one you can use indoors. It's typically used as an insecticide. It's an organic. Basically, you've got sharp shards that are, as the insects go across, it tears at their body structures. It's handy with soft-bodied insects. The problem is that sometimes with heavy rains especially, diatomaceous earth tends to get washed away, and so you have to reapply it. But diatomaceous earth can be part of an organic insect control program. So let's go back. So the purpose of this video was really to show you that, you know, you can go within the space of a year, you can turn your clay, thick, long soil into a nice fertile soil. And this soil that's over here on your left is nice black. It's got lots of organic matter in it. And basically all we did is we did that sheet mulching. This is that area that I was showing you before where we did that sheet mulching, put cover crops in it, and before you knew it, it had turned into this. And actually this was less than a year, really, I think, when this was ready when this was filmed, but it is a nice soil bed and it's been a productive bed. And so it's really, it's not beyond your capabilities to change your soil. It's really about improving the biology and adding that organic matter. There we go. So again, it's a good idea to start by getting your soil sample to see what nutrients you need, see where your pH is at. The other thing is look at your soil. You know, take a look at it from time to time and see how it's doing. The picture there of someone holding that soil, you can see if you look carefully, there's at least one worm in there, and it's got some macro pores, not a lot of micro pores, and it's okay. And it looks like that's a wheat field, really. I don't know if you can see with the cursor. Nice big macro pore. That's a nice place for roots to go. It's a nice place for this worm to travel through. You've got some micro pores. Some of them you can't see, but some of them can. Not a lot of root mass in here. So this is a soil that seems like they've started to work on it, but it still has some room to improve. And one of the ways you can see if your soil is improving is to regularly take a look at it. And so think about these sorts of physical things that you don't need a lab test for. How easily can you penetrate the soil 8 inches deep? And I usually, and you can do this with you can straighten a wire clothes hanger to do this. I do this with a wire. I drop it from waist height and see how easy it goes in the soil. And then I take that same wire and see how easy it is to push in the soil. You know, and you can judge how compacted your soil is by that. The harder it is to get in, the more compaction you have, the more you need to work on that. See how quickly water infiltrates. See how many species you can find. See how many fine roots there are in the root zone. See how easy the soil breaks into small centimeter-sized crumbs. A good soil will break apart with light pressure. If you take that soil and you drop it in some water and you swirl it around, does the soil hold together or does it turn the water all completely brown? And are your plants growing the way you would expect them to? Those are things that you can look at and just kind of judge from a season to season basis to see how you're doing, especially as you change your management strategies. So this is a nice soil. I mean, you can see the roots there, or in the worm. You can see macro pores, you can see micro pores. You've got really good root development throughout this. This over here is not actually a root. This is hyphae from fungus. And what this is doing, this is a good fungus, this is actually extending the reach of the roots. A lot of times our fungal hyphae will actually be able to extend the reach of the roots much farther and get into cracks the roots can't, and actually help extend the water capacity of our plants. And so in drought, they tend to be very, very helpful. So look at your soil, get an idea of your soil. I mean, this is a soil that has some organic matter. It's not as dark as you'd like to see it, but it's also, you can see that it's kind of sandy. This is probably more of an Eastern Shore soil, and they tend to be lower in organic matter, but you still have enough life going on. You've got so many roots in here, such good structure in there. Again, it's more about regularly adding that organic matter to help build your soil. And so how do we do that? Well, compost is our easiest way. Cover crops help, but compost is the way that we typically do this. And so if you're starting a garden, you want to amend with 200 pounds of compost per 1,000 square feet. And a 5-gallon bucket is roughly 20 pounds of compost. So 5 buckets of compost into your 100 square feet. That would be 10. If you're doing an established bed, you typically want to add somewhere between 50 and 100 pounds of compost. A lot of times what we do at our demonstration garden in Bristow is if we have to till, that's when we're going to add compost. Because again, we've disturbed the organisms underground from our tillage. And so we want to add that compost back because the carbon in that compost is going to be the energy that helps support those populations. So it's kind of like there's an earthquake, we disturbed the soil, now we're giving relief packages to help build those microbes up again. So we're really recommending whenever you have to till or disturb the soil, add compost after it. And again, remember that a quarter to a third of the organic matter that's naturally added to the soil comes from the living roots of plants as they slough off cells. And so we want to keep our soil ideally planted all the year round. You do want to be careful with adding some non-composted organic matter. One of the things that we find is, especially plant matter that's high in carbon, if you add that to the soil, because of the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in most of our microbes, they're going to need nitrogen to digest carbon. And so sometimes that will temporarily pull things out of the soil, and so your plant available nitrogen may go down for a week or two, but that's just a temporary thing. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're adding raw manures or manures that haven't been fully composted, you can run into all sorts of problems. There are some herbicides that will pass through livestock and still be in that uncomposted manure. So you put down this manure thinking you put down this great organic matter, but really what you've done is you put down an herbicide that's going to kill more of your plants. And we've seen that happen several times in the county. The other thing is that you may have undigested weed seeds in that manure, and because it hasn't been fully composted, those weed seeds haven't been killed, and so again, you're thinking you're putting down this nice good organic matter, and what you're really doing is seeding your garden with weeds. So raw manure is something that's kind of tricky to work with, and we recommend avoiding that unless it's been really composted for a good while. So compost does have some nutrients in it, but in Virginia anyway, we don't classify it as a fertilizer. Really what you're doing again is you're providing carbon or energy for the soil organisms, and you're driving that ecosystem underground. And because you're driving that ecosystem, a lot of times you don't really need to add fertilizer. In our demonstration gardens in Bristow, it's very rare that we add fertilizer. Last year we had to add some fertilizer to one of our beds because we saw a nitrogen deficiency. Occasionally when we've got heavy tomato production, we'll add some fertilizer, but most of the time we don't add fertilizer at all. We allow the biology to do it for us. The other thing about organic matter is it will help retain moisture in the soil. It's kind of spongy, and so before it gets fully digested by our microbes, it acts as a sink for water. And again, in a drought situation, that's pretty handy. You want to make sure that you're irrigating your garden consistently, and think about the type of plant, stage of the plant, what it needs. So if you think about fruiting vegetables like tomatoes, there's a lot of water in tomatoes. They tend to need a little more water when they're flowering and fruiting and setting seed. Our leafy greens are all drought sensitive because they are pretty much water. They have high water content, and so they need significant watering, consistent watering throughout their growing season. Our heading vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower, and some of our heading cabbages and lettuces, once they start forming the head, they need more water. Root crops tend to be most sensitive when the roots or tubers start to enlarge. Keep in mind that too much water can cause problems like blossom end rot, like root rot. So what we want is infrequent watering. When we do frequent light watering, it reduces our root growth. It keeps the roots on the soil surface. When we do infrequent deep watering, our roots tend to grow deeper. We increase our drought tolerance. When we're talking about infrequent deep watering, we're talking about an inch of water applied once a week, and then possibly supplemented with a little bit more during drought situations and high heat situations. We want to water at the bottom to reduce our disease pressure. A lot of plants, tomatoes are notorious for this, have problems with soil-borne disease. And so when we water from a high distance, we've got those water droplets are going down, they're hitting the soil, and it's splashing back up onto the lower leaves. And that's bringing disease to the plant. So by watering at the base, we're avoiding that splashing, and we're trying to keep those disease organisms off the plant. We want to water early in the morning. This will help with the water going into the soil and not evaporating off. And we want to mulch where possible to help retain that moisture in the soil. Now, you don't necessarily have to garden in the ground. And so you need to think about, if you're not gardening in the ground, that our raised beds and our pots and containers are gonna heat up more quickly and usually will drain more quickly. And so they need to be watered on a more frequent basis. Pots and small containers are watered more frequently. Raised beds are kind of in the middle, and then less frequently in the actual soil. Other things we want to do is, if we've made a nice garden bed, we've reduced compaction, we've got that nice fluffy soil, we don't want to walk on that soil and recompact it. And so we want to make permanent paths. If you have to, ideally you want garden beds that are narrow enough so that you can reach the center from both sides. That way you won't have to worry about walking on them. But if you do have to walk on them, you can use a digging board, and in the top right picture shows a digging board, and that helps distribute the weight, and so the compaction is not as great when you do that. And again, we want to minimize tillage to avoid compaction. These bottom two pictures, if you look at the picture on the left, that soil is heavily compacted, and so that water's not draining. And because of that, the water's just ponding on top. That's not being very helpful at all, especially if you've got crops in there. Seeds in there are not going to grow, they're going to rot before they. You can till it, you can do some tillage or breaking up of soil with cover crops, like the picture on the lower right, where we've got what are referred to as tillage radishes. These are radishes that have long, thick roots. They break down and they help open up the soil.
Okay,
Cover
Valerie,
crops, again, I mentioned
pause here.
cover crops allow you to use the sun throughout the year.
Yes.
Okay, so guys, it is 2:03 right now, so if you guys need to go or have any last minute questions, let me know. We will keep playing the video as was planned throughout all of this. If you do need to go, thank you so much for coming. They don't touch on cover crops in this video, but I do want to say that on September 11th, which I know is a long time from now, but I still want to preface this. September 11th, we are having a cover crops workshop. So if you are interested about that, go ahead, sign up. It's on September 11th, when you are more likely to start gathering cover crops. So yeah, if anyone needs to go, it was nice to have you guys here. Thank you so much for all this.
And the video will also be posted on the Manassas Park City Library's website as well, if you miss anything or want to go back and watch it.
Yes.
But are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and resume the video. Okay.
put that energy into your soil. They're really going to support your ecosystem. They're going to foster those symbiotic relationships between plants and microbes. They're going to keep building your soil even in the wintertime. They're going to help keep nutrients from being leached away or washed away. You think about it, like for example, beans produce a lot of nitrogen in the soil. And if you have beans and it's followed by nothing on the soil, you get heavy rains, all of that nitrogen is going to, or most of that nitrogen is going to get leached out of the soil. Whereas if you had a crop following that, they would take up that nitrogen and hold on to it. And cover crops can also add nutrients to the soil. We can plant members of the legume family specifically to add nitrogen. We can plant buckwheat, for example, to pull phosphorus from deep in the soil. So there are lots of things you can do with cover crops, and we won't go into all of those today, but cover crops are typically used in our area late fall into the spring, although occasionally they can be used in the summer when you're in between crops. But it's a good way to keep your garden working for you, even when you're not necessarily expecting a harvest from it.
Okay, that's where I wanted to stop the video for the 45-minute mark. Obviously, we've had some troubles like online, but I'm happy that you guys are staying here. Valerie, if you could hand me over, if you could stop sharing your screen just so I could hit on.
Sure.
Okay, some things that didn't make it into the 45-minute mark was this chart right here. This chart is in the seed exchange box. I printed it off. It's on the door to the seed exchange box, so you should be able to like read through it, see which ones you want to challenge yourself with, see which ones like are easier for you if you're a beginner. I'm pretty sure that was the only chart on here that I wanted to like mainly preface. If you want to see the whole, yeah, this one was the other one. If you want to see the whole Getting Started Gardening video, it's on the VCE's YouTube channel. So again, we are jumping through some slides here. But if you want to see the whole video, it's on the Virginia Cooperative Extension's Prince William's YouTube channel. The other chart that I wanted to show you guys was the frosting, the planting, the harvesting chart. Again, this is also on the door to the seed exchange box. It shows you what crops like you can start harvesting, what crops you can start planting, things like that. And yeah, thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If we can't answer them, then you can always ask the Master Gardener Horticultural Help Desk. Their email is right there. So yeah, any questions? Again, thank you all so much for coming.